Well, good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to our webinar, Scaling GenAI, Get Big Value from Smaller Efforts. I'm Abby Lundberg, Editor-in-Chief at the MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be moderating the event. Today's program is sponsored by Celonis. Despite 2 years of a lot of experimentation, most companies aren't seeing the large-scale GenAI transformation they first envisioned. Our speakers today have developed a 3-step framework to help organizations generate real value at different levels of investment while effectively managing the risks that GenAI innovations can bring. In today's webinar, you'll learn how successful companies like McKinsey, CarMax, and Morgan Stanley are getting value today from small T transformations, and how to move from pilot to enterprise scale while managing data, security, and compliance. Our speakers have written about this for MIT Sloan Management Review. You'll find that article in the handouts section for download, and we'll also post the link in the chat. So let me introduce our speakers. Melissa Webster is a senior lecturer in managerial communication at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Her research focuses on how organizations communicate and implement new technologies with a particular focus on digital transformation in AI adoption strategies. George Westerman is a senior lecturer at the MIT Sloan School and co-author of the award-winning book, Leading Digital: Turning Technology into Business Transformation. He's a leading expert on digital and AI transformation, advising numerous Fortune 500 companies on their digital strategies. Welcome, Melissa and George.
Hi, Abby, and hi, everybody. I'm really glad to be here to share this research. Hopefully it can be useful for you as you go about making your own strategies happen. So if you can't tell, I'm George. Melissa is the other person. And let's talk about this research here. So this is the big question. When will we see the major transformations with generative AI? We set out to write this article about the major transformations that were happening with generative AI. And to our dismay, we didn't find any, or we found very few. And when we sat back and looked and said, why is that? We actually found there was a much more interesting, and I think much more smart approach that companies were taking than just jumping into the big things. And that's what we want to share today. So here's what we heard when we talked to leaders around the world about what they're doing. It's easy to do the proofs of concept, but bringing it to the right level of trust in a large group of users is much more difficult. Another leader said it much more succinctly. She said that, that low-hanging fruit, it's not really so low. And so that was the question, how are people approaching it when they see this challenge? So what we want to do in the next hour is these 3 things. Number 1, just setting the scenes. I'll set the scenes, and then we'll talk about this growth slope, and Melissa will take over from there, and then we'll go back and forth. And we'll end with what's next. Where do we think things are going? So just to set the scene, here's the challenge. It's a huge opportunity from generative AI. We've all been talking about that. But there are also huge risks and concerns in implementing these things, especially if you start talking about taking the human out of the loop. So what is the right strategy? How fast do we want to go? Where do we want to use it? And how do we handle the capabilities that we need to develop in between there? So this is the article that Abby talked about. And this is what we're going to go through in the next hour or so. So what we found is not that companies are either staying away from the big changes or jumping right into the big changes. What we found is that the smart leaders are taking a much more measured and systematic approach to getting to the large things that they want to implement. And we saw that really in 3 stages, these things are happening. Number 1, they're starting with creating a safe environment for individuals to do their own productivity work. And we call that level 1. They're then taking on specific, well-defined tasks and roles and starting to implement GenAI improvements in those areas. And those are setting the stage to take on these bigger challenges. But what they're doing is at every step of the way, they're learning how to manage risk. They're learning about their tools. They're building up capabilities in the technology people and the rest of the employees to be able to move forward to those bigger opportunities later. So having said these three things, we want to ask you a poll. And I'll go back again to the picture in just a second. But the poll is this. When you think about these three things I just talked about, the individual productivity, changing some specialized roles such as coding and call centers or customer support, maybe in some marketing efforts, or if you think about the more greater autonomy in the bigger things, what's the highest peak that your organization has climbed so far? So Sam, can you launch that poll? There we go. So people are already starting to fill out this poll, and let's keep going and see who wins. What's happening so far is we see that the individual productivity is in the lead, and this is what we're seeing in companies also, that this is a good place to start. It's relatively low risk. The cost doesn't have to be too high, and it's an opportunity to get in there and just get people comfortable, and also get the technology people comfortable. We see some piloting in level 2, and Melissa's going to talk about that a lot more too. A little bit of piloting in level 3, and we do have a few intrepid souls that are putting level 3 in production, and that'll be interesting. We'll come back to that in a bit. Those of you who are doing none, it's probably a good chance to start moving into level 1 as soon as you can, because your employees are doing it. I would say your employees are doing it whether you know it or not. So what do you think, Melissa? Should we take it from here?
Yeah, I was just going to comment that these numbers look similar to other groups that I speak with as well. So everyone, you're in good company.
On to level 1. What we're going to do now is we're just going to go through each of the levels and talk about them in more detail, so you can think about what you are doing and what else you might do as you're in these levels.
Okay, so level 1, individual productivity, which is where the greatest number of your organizations are. This will sound probably somewhat familiar, but let's visit anyway. And this was my team's research in the spring, that these were very common use cases among the advanced users that we were talking to. So you can see inbox management, meeting support, calendar optimization, briefing prep. A couple use cases I'll call out that I hear less commonly, but might be interesting. One for written communication, or even planning spoken communication, to ask the LLM to help you put it in a different voice or different cultural norms. So I remember someone in the audience from Europe saying, oh yes, I recently started working with American teams, and I've been asking the LLM to translate my English into a more American style of business writing. So as a communication professor, I definitely appreciate that use. All right, so on to look at a few specific things, and let's actually start with the right-hand side, the company-specific tools. Those tend to be a little bit later in the adoption, depending on the organization. McKinsey, many other companies have built similar tools where it is allowing employees to access many hundreds of thousands of pages often of internal sources, and be able to draw from those to work more effectively. You can see within a year, 75% of employees were using it actively, and up to 30% time savings, also improved quality. And a couple notes about external tools. The logo the black logo that may be a little less familiar to you, that was a product manager in big tech using Super Whisper to dictate, summarize, and clean up their thoughts during performance reviews. And that flexibility around voice capability is another one that I see more advanced users doing, such as talking with ChatGPT on their way home during the day to pull their thoughts together, synthesize the day's happenings, and then be able to reference that transcript later. And Copilot and Gemini for organizations that are Microsoft houses or Google Workspace houses. They get a lot of the benefits of McKinsey's Lilly, for instance, of being able to access and draw on the existing files and systems. And lastly, I'll mention that Perplexity, which is one my team doing research uses a fair amount. That was one that a product manager in a big tech firm that had the authorized LLMs to use was also using Perplexity to cross-reference info. And so that employees making choices alongside or maybe even outside of your guidelines is a very real thing, sometimes called shadow AI or yes. So to summarize here, two things to keep in mind. On one hand, a lot of this may seem familiar by now. And if it doesn't, as George encouraged you, time to jump in. On the other hand, mid-level managers and executives that I meet with could be doing more here. The common use cases tend to be around writing, summarizing, maybe travel, but there is so much more that you can do. So I encourage you to keep expanding in level 1, even as you're looking at where to go in level 2 or 3. All right, so on to level 2. And this is where, as George mentioned, we're looking at these specialized roles and tasks. We'll look at a few of those now. So starting with coding and data science, this was early adopters of GenAI. You are seeing developers using it for code, finding useful libraries, et cetera, and a lot of stats in terms of more productivity, as well as, I find this an interesting one, a lot of developers finding that they're happier about the work, that now they have a partner developer that they get to work with. They don't stay stuck on things, and they are able to address tickets that may have been sitting around for a couple of years because there wasn't a good way to solve it before. And now with help, they're able to do that. One quote from our research in the spring, GenAI can mirror a junior analyst or engineer that works 24/7 and improves with better prompting. So speaking to the impact on this data systems architect coding workflows. And we're noticing this, of course, in headlines and in jobs around the world in terms of AI tools reshaping the coding workforce and in some ways bringing a lot of uncertainty with it. Some other early uses, customer service and sales being ones we were seeing a lot as well. So Amazon Pharmacy using LLMs to support customer care representatives, CarMax for summarizing reviews, and they found that the hours of reviews that it was 5,000 reviews, it was more than 5,000, that instead of taking multiple worker years to go through those, it was just a few hours. Cisco generating personalized scripts for sales calls. And then John Hancock with the chatbot assistants handling common queries, and then the more complex ones being routed to human agents. And that's a theme in general that you see in level 2 is a working with LLMs, that it's humans and AI together, and finding the places that the AI can support the humans, and for the humans to be overseeing the work of the AI. And then this research by my colleagues here at MIT and elsewhere found that in a call center, the tool increased productivity by 14% on average, including the 34% for novice and low-skilled workers, which with the turnover in call centers is really helpful to be able to help folks with moving up that learning curve. All right, then finance and auditing. I was not expecting to see a lot in this, but we did see that that adoption is beginning. So one international energy company using it in the auditing group to suggest mitigations, help rewrite an audit report. And then an interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal about Amazon and the finance function, the uses there leading to improved performance and a shift of focus to work that involves more critical thinking. And then this one, I know George loves to talk about this. Would you take this one?
So Dentsu is a really interesting idea for what they're doing, and this really combines level 1 and level 2. It also really talks about something that's coming up in the chat, which is how do you orchestrate the fast movers and the slow movers? You can think about orchestrating those from unit to unit, but we can think about doing it also within particular organizations. So Dentsu is an advertising and creative company, and they do the kinds of things you'd expect. A lot of short projects and long projects where you got to plan those projects, a lot of writing and graphics, and a lot of iterating to come up to a common, something that works for the client, not just for themselves. And they found an opportunity to use generative AI in many different places. You can imagine this might have felt threatening to many of the people in this world. And what they did is they started off in a way to say, let's not make this threatening. Let's make it better for people. So what they did, first of all, is they just did level 1. They created a set of tools and a set of practices that they said, have fun with this. Go do whatever you feel like is the right thing. But what we want you to do is get together on a weekly basis to share what you're learning. So that if you learn something cool, tell other people about it. Now, at the same time they did that, the technology people were also building on capabilities and things that could happen. But what they learned from these office hours were 2 things. Number 1, you didn't need to wait. You could already do things to make yourself productive. Number 2, though, some of these are really good ideas. So if they saw 2 or 3 different approaches to the same problem, now the technical people could come up with a common approach that they could make as an easy task for people to do. So the level 1 work that they used to get people comfortable, to reduce some of the fear, then moved into level 2 things that started to transform the way the organization operated. So for example, now budgets are, you push a button, your budget happens, and then you tweak it. Same thing with schedules, proposals, these kinds of things. And the other thing they learned is the ideating and visualizing in a room. They no longer had to say, hey, come back in a week, we're going to have some more creative stuff for you. They said, let's do this together and let's figure out what works. Completely changing the process with the clients. That worked better for the clients and also for the people in the organization. So this is an idea that level 1 led into level 2 that's leading to really interesting things for the organization. So let's go on to the chat. What are you doing in level 2 in your organization? And I'll pull up the chat screen here.
While we're waiting for folks to enter their responses about implementations in level 2, I noticed a question in the chat about the difference between generative AI or regular AI, and that's a great one to touch on, which AI is the largest category. Within that, you have machine learning. Within that, you have deep learning. And then within that is generative AI. And generative AI, the key word there is generative. So you'll see the LLM generating text, generating images, generating voice, video, etc. The challenge comes is now that people are using the terms very interchangeably. So you really have to pay attention when someone is talking about AI. Are they referencing GenAI specifically? And the other term you'll hear people using is large language models or LLMs, such as ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude. And sometimes they may mean GenAI. Sometimes they might mean a combination of them. Yeah, so it does take a little attention. We are primarily talking about GenAI, but sometimes you'll hear us talking about companies using a mix. George, anything you want to add on that?
I thought that was great. The key point that I want to reinforce that Melissa said is just because we're all saying the word AI doesn't mean we all mean the same thing. So it's worth it to develop some shared understanding. Make sure you're talking about the same things.
Thanks, everyone, for entering in the chat what you are doing in level 2.
So we see things from cybersecurity assessments, very nice, and dashboard creation, agents handling customer service calls, perfect. So these are examples we definitely saw in our research. Some things that we did not see is, for example, vehicle service maintenance invoice analysis. That's very interesting, Alexander. Thanks for sharing that. I wouldn't, right now I'm in the middle of a car repair, and this would have been very nice instead of calling 3 different people and getting 3 different answers.
Yeah, I also see some folks mentioning agents, so stay tuned on that. We'll have another question later about agents.
So, and then we have BART automatically processing invoices. Now, it's interesting you said without losing the human touch. So that if you could, Bart, say a little bit more about how you're balancing the replacing people versus keeping the human touch in there. SP is talking about writing user stories. So not only helping in the coding process, but actually writing the story cards too, which is very interesting. Thank you for sharing these. So let's jump on to level 3, and then please keep sharing these things in the chat, because we're all learning from these examples. So level 3, we move to the higher risk, more worrisome kinds of things that are happening, and often, and these can require a whole lot of capability development. These can require a whole lot of risk management, and that's why companies are taking a careful approach to get up to this stage. Now, we do see companies doing things in level 3. GenAI features in products and services is one place we're seeing a lot of this. We're starting to see more direct engagement. And the question is whether it's the very simple, okay, I need to change my password. We know how to do that, or the more complicated engagements that are happening here. And we're starting to see, but not yet as much, the really transformation of the underwriting process or the regulatory process. It's starting to happen, but we're not seeing as much of it yet. So just to give you some examples here, here's Penty again, who we saw earlier. What he's being really clear about, and our other informants are being very clear about it also, is we're not going to see a Gen AI solution for these level 3 problems. What we're going to see is level 3 solutions that include Gen AI and other things in there. Technologies, tools, and people. You're going to look at the process, and we're going to figure out among those tasks, where is Gen AI a good opportunity, a good solution? Where are the other things? And also, how are we going to integrate across? And as Melissa gets into the agentic, that integration also becomes much more possible than it was before. Remember that the numbers are saying somewhere, last numbers I saw from ISG was that 15% of successful bench pilots ever scale. So it's that low-hanging fruit maybe not being as low. These are tough challenges, and companies are making progress, but it's not happening everywhere yet. So let's look at what Adobe's doing. One of the things we are seeing a lot is software vendors adding this to their tools. And this is really good to see, because GenAI can do amazing things in that case. So Adobe, for example, they can help with rapid content creation. And the kinds of things you can do to customize the graphics and other elements that you're doing, it's really phenomenal. Adobe and other tools. But then they start to move towards level 3. Can we use this to help manage your content? Find, reuse, and share content with governance rules applied. Can they start to manage your campaigns for them? Can they deploy the right assets? These kinds of things start looking much more like level 3. And we're seeing this in more and more software companies. So for example, SAP, they now have chatbots that can do a lot for you, and they're moving beyond the chatbots to actually make decisions and do work for you. Same thing in Workday. So if you have certain tools that you're already using, one opportunity you have is to start activating the level 3 features that they have. Now you want to do it safely, but at least they've handled part of the problem for you. And where you can go is things like this. Lemonade sells insurance, and they're selling 98% of their policies, and they're paying out 50% of their claims from start to finish without any human intervention. Now, Lemonade has a business model that is more amenable to this kind of work, but we're starting to see this in many companies, especially the simpler work being done just automatically. This idea of paying, and not only taking the information for a form, but actually making decisions and paying out claims. We're starting to see more of that in organizations. So, and what's happening, for example, is organizations that are starting to use agents, and Melissa will talk more about that, where the agents can start to say, okay, we can figure out whether this is an easy problem or not. Let's look at underwriting insurance policies or something like that. And where we agree that this is right, we can take action. We'll recommend the action. And where we don't agree it's right, we'll make sure a human continues to be part of that loop. So this leads on over to level beyond the going forward part. And this is where, Melissa, you get to take over again.
Great. All right. So going forward, you may have heard the word agents this year. And Jensen Huang of NVIDIA is optimistic that AI agents will become the next big thing for artificial intelligence. It is predicted to be the year of the word, the word of the year. But 5 days ago, Andre Karpathy, co-founder of OpenAI, 5 days ago, he said, year of the decade, that long to really implement and see the full effects of agents. Okay, so we're going back to you for the chat in terms of what you're doing for agents. I know some people named agents in level 2, but feel free to rename them or bring ones you didn't mention into the chat now. I'd love to hear what you have implemented.
Meanwhile, I'm catching up with all the comments on level 2. It's going to be fun to read these later too. Thank you for all the ideas.
I really like to see the engagement here. This is, we're trying to respond to a few of them, but we really look forward to digging into them later.
And then we also have some people that say we're still trying to get off the block, and that's totally fine. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. Just make sure you get off the block.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a company I'm talking to right now about doing a session for their C-suite and direct reports. And they're looking at the block. They have not really launched yet. So I look forward to being part of that.
So let's take a look at some of the level 3s. And I'm trying to remember where we asked. Planning my holidays is, okay, here we go. Complete automation of a core marketing team, copywriter, all those people. This is really interesting. And one of my students in a class on AI leadership has done that very same thing. He has a small 40-person marketing organization, and they are really automating most of their stuff so that they can get more value out of the human elements that happen in there. And he's finding his people are happier that way.
Yeah. All right. Shall I move us along?
We see a lot of not really, a lot of none at this stage. And that's kind of what we were hearing when we did our dozens of interviews also.
Yeah. For me, my team, it was a distinct shift between the spring research and the summer research, that in the summer, agentic was something that people were paying attention to a lot more. I have a stat from that in a moment. Mm-hmm. And please, by all means, continue in the chat. I encourage you also to reply to each other. Meanwhile, I'll point out that the big vendors have released agentic capability within the LLM. So within Claude, for instance, within ChatGPT, Manus, that was certainly very talked about when Manus came out, the agent capabilities there. So you see them within the LLMs as one option. Just to back up for a minute here in terms of what do we mean by agent? So autonomous task execution. So to take it to a human model for a moment, think about maybe back in the day when you worked with a travel agent, a human travel agent. And so you would call up this travel agent and tell them the trip that you were interested in, your budget, your timing, various preferences that you had. And then the travel agent would go off by themselves and do all of that exploration for you. Depending on your particular request and how familiar they were working with you, they might come back to you to check on some of those preferences, or they might just go ahead and make the bookings for you, presenting the whole trip to you when you're done. All right, so that is acting agentically, acting as an agent for you. And so technology also, when is it able to act autonomously on your behalf? So the one that I use the most is actually in ChatGPT's deep research, and I give it my research request, my research specifications, much like I would give them to one of my human research assistants. And it goes off, looks things up, checks them out, decides what else to look up without me having to look every step of the way. I can open it up and see how it's doing as it's in that process, but it is acting agentically on my behalf. All right. So multi-agent systems or agentic AI, and these terms do get sort of used interchangeably. I have noticed people using AI agents. I've noticed them using that term pretty broadly to apply to a lot of things. So again, another area for potential confusion. With a multi-agent system, you have an AI manager overseeing specialized agents. So if we go back to your vacation, you don't want to just book your vacation. You also need to take care of maybe some shopping to do in advance. You need to arrange pet care. You need to arrange somebody to come water the plants, everything else that needs to happen in order for you to take this trip are all things that need to be done. And with a multi-agent system, it is using individual agents for those different tasks. So an agent handling travel for you, an agent handling shopping for you, an agent handling the arrangement of pet care. I don't know if this exists yet as a technical, as a virtual AI multi-agent system to make everything for your trip happen, but I suspect it's coming. So to give you that analogy on the human side. Okay, then this is the data from my research among our interviewees. Yes, a small number, 30 interviewees this summer, that 37.5% of them were doing some form of agentic or semi-autonomous use. Again, this was a big jump from the spring when the word rarely came up. And that contrasts to 62.5% really staying with bounded use. And as I mentioned, this was a big step up in terms of the experimentation we're seeing, and it is quite a range. So looking here at an illustration from Gartner and seeing agentic AI as a continuum. So on that right-hand side, you see the rigid, reactive, static at one end of the spectrum. On the right-hand side, the proactive, independent, evolving. So that spectrum, and AI assistants on the lower end of that, but then AI agents at the higher end. And that when people are talking about AI agents, they really could be talking anywhere along that spectrum. So certainly when it comes to implementations that you're considering, you need to be more specific about exactly what your needs are. I will say that the AI assistant end of the spectrum is a great place to be experimenting. The deep research, for instance, or other easily accessible options for you. ChatGPT's agent mode, for instance, is another one where you can have it do research, create documents, many steps along a process, acting independently for you autonomously. All right, so one of our interviewees, sales VP at a big tech company, I do these things with essentially an assistant where it uses agents in the background to invoke SAP SuccessFactors processes, transferring employees, providing increases, stock awards, and so on. And so starting to see some of that internal process transformation that George talked about in level 3 happening in this organization. And one more to share with you, everybody's trying to crack automated research. We might literally have a machine that generates ideas soon. This from our portfolio manager at a hedge fund. So certainly plenty of enthusiasm and also a certain amount of skepticism at the same time. And my advice, don't rush, but do wherever, and this is our overall message, wherever you are, be looking to that next mountain. What is the growth that you can move into next? So if you're just in level 1, maybe the AI assistance would be the exploration area, but build up the competency before you go for the larger swings. So a couple key things to think about: look closely at the work. How standard is the work? How varied is the work? And thinking about what agent or not will be suited to that. So thinking about the work and the needs. Yes, agent is the year of the word, potentially, or the year of the decade even. But the solution for what you need might actually be simpler than an agent. So in the fervor of agents, do remember to look still at rules-based automation, at predictive analytics, and at LLMs. So which one of those forms of AI is something to consider. And lastly, McKinsey, in some coverage on this, talked about companies thinking about the benefits of reusable agents. So avoiding very single task, single process agents, and looking for agents that could plug in multiple ways for the company. All right, so taking us to the wrap up.
So I want to come back to this quote because I'm working with a lot of companies, interviewing a lot of people about what are they doing here and what are they doing in agentic. And the answer I hear very often now is, oh yeah, we're doing that. We will have something for that soon. And so just to highlight that it is the year of agents or the decade of agents, and everybody's going after it. Really getting it scalable is a challenge, and people will continue to work on those challenges. So as a wrap up, really, there's a gold rush mentality going on with generative AI right now. And that's a serious push with the hype that's happening to get something done now and have something that the company can talk about. And Prem Natarajan from Capital One said it very clearly here. Building the right strategy doesn't go hand in hand with this gold rush mentality that we have to mine it now. And figure out instead how to do it thoughtfully and responsibly. Build the scaffolding to bring everybody along. And that's really what we found in the research, and why we published this framework is this framework can give you the scaffolding to build up each step of the way, the employee engagement, the risk management, and the tools, and also the answers to move along to each step of the way. So don't feel bad that you're not yet at level 3, but certainly think about how are you going to start climbing those mountains to get to the goals that you want to go for. I do want to remind everybody that also this is not a hammer looking for nails. Look for problems that need to be solved that this tool might be a useful tool for, because some of the problems to be solved may be better solved by a different tool or even by leaving them as manual efforts. So back to what Pentti Tofti said, the answers to these bigger problems will be combinations of GenAI, other AI, traditional IT, even non-IT tools, and people executing the right tasks in the right way, synchronized the right way. So as we think about building your generative AI strategy, think about it this way. First of all, think about some key pioneers. Who is already doing this, whether they're telling you or not, and make it safe for them to tell you and to share their ideas. Number 2, think about where you are on the slope and how you're going to move forward on there. You do want to build some management buy-in. This is risky. You want to make sure that the managers above you understand what you're doing and how you're doing it in a safe way while still trying to make progress. Then start these small T transformations. Start to climb those mountains and then think about how you're going to climb the next mountain. And the way to start that is not to force it on everybody. Find people who want to work with you and help them do better for themselves and for the organization. But you do want to be careful in your promises and your activities not to get ahead of your capabilities. That idea that 15%, only 1 out of 6 successful bench pilots actually make it to scalability is a strong warning that maybe what we need to do is make sure that we got some capability development, not just a cool bench test. And that's where the green comes in. What are you doing for your data investments, your skill investments, the models you're building? How are you moving through the steps? And the other thing to be really clear about, and it came up in the comments also, some parts of your organization may be in a better position to move quickly than others. And that's an opportunity because you can learn, you can get around the idea this won't work here. And you can also make some mistakes there. So the people who are a little more nervous or need to go more slowly can learn from that. And then finally, don't forget, we're talking about a mix of GenAI and other methods, not a full GenAI solution at level 3. So we do have this, the GenAI Strategy and Governance Toolkit that we put together in management review. And this is available. It's got some good frameworks and some good articles and other things to really help you figure out not only what is your strategy to get started, but how do you think about the organization-wide governance and the capability building you need to do to reach those more scalable, more level 3 AI applications when you are ready. We would ask you also this one, please stay in touch. We love talking to people. We love hearing from you, and hopefully we can help you also. So these are ways to get in touch with us on LinkedIn. Over to Abby.
Melissa and George, thank you so much. So much good information, a lot to absorb, and we're getting a lot of great questions from the audience. Not surprising, we've got a terrific audience. So I'm going to start with this one that sort of gets to the fundamental question of your model. And so this is from Daniel. He says, can you give an estimate of how great the productivity and other gains are at each of the 3 levels? You don't have to answer that yet, because the real question, I think, that comes out of this comment is more about the model itself. So it says, I see and recommend exactly the same steps as you brought up, but I also think there is some merit to Sangeet Paul Chowdhury's statement that if you just focus on individual productivity gains, you will only cement and work along current workflows rather than reinventing them. And I think the question that's implied in that statement is, are companies missing out in some way by focusing on small T transformations?
So Melissa, okay if I jump on this one and take the answer? So I think 2 things you want to think about. Let's take the first one, the second one first. So if you think about the opportunity space as a very rugged landscape where you're climbing hills and trying to reach the best peak that's out there, certainly what Sanjeet said and what we all say as researchers on innovation is just climbing the slope, taking steps on the slope that you're on is not enough, because there may be another whole mountain over there you don't even see. And so that's why in this 3-step process we've talked about, individual is only step 1. And it's just an idea of building capability, helping your people get comfortable. But step 2 is not looking at individual tasks. Step 2 is looking at reinventing roles, reinventing well-defined tasks that we can manage. And then step 3 is even better, just transforming the whole thing. So certainly Sangeet is right. He's a really smart guy, but that's not what we're saying here. That first peak is just the start, so you can do the exploration and the exploitation that academics like to talk about. Now, the second one is, do we have ideas on how to measure the performance gains in each of these tasks? Every time an innovation comes out and every time a technology comes out, people say, tell me their ROI. And the answer that I've seen in the research that I've done is always the same. The ROI will vary depending on what task you're trying to improve and how you're improving it. So it's hard to say, here's a general ROI. Now, we certainly had the Microsoft stuff on how the general ROI on coding earlier. But the way I would think about it is, what are you trying to improve? Let's look at the before and the potential after, and there's the ROI you're going to get.
Great. So Mohit raises the question, sort of linked to what you just said about the, there's this data point from MIT that everybody cited when it first came out. About 95% of GenAI initiatives don't deliver. Can you speak to that? Do you think that we're in this GenAI bubble, and to what extent is it a bubble? How much of it is real? And do you think that this bubble can disrupt markets just like the dot-com bubble did? Two questions in there, I think.
Yeah, I think so. We have both the usage question and the markets question. And in terms of usage, so one thing to remember is the Gartner hype cycle. So to refresh for folks, if we think about the expectations around a technology, and then we think about time, that once a technology comes out, it rises up to the peak of inflated expectations. Then it goes into this trough of disillusionment. But after the trough of disillusionment, you continue on to the plateau of productivity, and then on to your real measures. And so that can be going on. And what I have found is where people think we are on that curve depends on the person and depends on the organization. So some have really come through that trough of disillusionment and are working on that plateau and the slope of enlightenment and plateau of productivity. There we go. Slope of enlightenment, plateau of productivity are moving up that. So your perspective will change depending, your view on that will change depending on your experience, your organization. And in terms of the study, the headline that was taken from the study was one piece of it. And it was, I think, well chosen to be a very attention-getting headline. The study overall was actually a pretty small number of interviews, not that many more than I've done in my research this year. And also, it was based on reports, annual reports from companies, and did they mention AI or not? So I think it's much more nuanced than the headline would suggest. My interpretation is that there is a percentage of failed pilots. It's nothing as high as 95%. George would have a better sense of kind of what is a normal percent with any new technology innovation, and that the experimentation required here is going to mean that there is a failure rate, and a failure rate does not mean that you're not getting to good things. It means you're figuring out where the good things are. You're finding all of the needles in the haystack. So George, additional thoughts here?
I agree with Melissa. What you want to do when you look at these numbers is look at what is their source of data. Who are they talking to? Are those people, what kinds of roles do those people play? And how are they interpreting the idea of successful, failure, and initiative? And so for the methodology that team used, their numbers are fine. Other people use other methodologies, other informants, and they get different numbers. What we do find, though, is there's a large number, right? 70, 80, 85, in that case, 95%. There's a lot of organizations are not getting the value that they want, and that's very typical early in the hype cycle. So one thing you could think about is, are they making good choices on what to try? Because that's where we go next, is thinking in the governance angle, how do we choose opportunities that are both high in value and high in feasibility? And then you're more likely to be successful. The second's the change management, of course. Are we doing this as a bunch of technology people saying how we're going to change how you market? Or are we doing it with the marketing people to help them change their own processes?
Great. So Yaroslav asked, so getting specific about some of your research, he asked, are there examples you give, particularly in fraud detection or finance, in wide production? And if so, what is the error rate for these, and what are the resolution mechanisms when and if mistakes do happen? And maybe
I wish I knew.
I was going to say.
Maybe that's the next study we'll do. Certainly, one thing to keep in mind here is that these models do make mistakes. Now they're making fewer mistakes as you put in RAG and other opportunities to make sure that the hallucinations are less. But on the other hand, human workers make mistakes too. And the way we handle human workers making mistakes is we put the right level of oversight, review, and controls in place. So very few human mistakes turn around to hurt the company. And we want to think the same way with with the AI, how do we have the controls and the reviews in place to avoid those mistakes? Even if it's better, there is a typical desire among us as humans to really play up the stories when the robots make mistakes. And robots are going to make mistakes. People are going to make mistakes. How can we manage them so they make fewer mistakes that hurt us?
Great. On the people front, there's a lot of unknowns around how this is affecting the people that are in your company, the people you're bringing into your company. And so Michael said a lot of initial deployments in a scaled approach may remove skill and experience building tasks from the education process of employees, especially people new to the industry or the process. How do you deploy solutions while maintaining the foundational skills needed in your future executives? Should access to AI solutions be based on established core capabilities?
So I grapple with this as somebody teaching communication, or this semester teaching communicating with data. And my students, MIT undergraduates, have access to an assistant that 3 years ago, none of them had access to. And that has really changed both the expectation for what they need to be able to do in the future workplace, but also what they can do in my classroom. And I will say I have not solved the question of how do I teach them to do those higher level skills when they don't have to do as many repetitions on the lower level skills. I'm trying out different things, but I have not reached that to my satisfaction. And I have not heard in my research of organizations that seem to have really solved this either. Some of the things that I think about are figuring out how to teach people to do evaluation. And so I mentioned that my students have assistants now. How do I teach them to manage assistants? And like I said, haven't cracked it yet, but experimenting with that. And that is one of now the challenges of our age is how do we prepare to be the leaders, the managers of tomorrow when our process of getting there is changing? George?
What Melissa said, right? It's very difficult. I do want to highlight, though, that I am of a certain age. To tell you how long ago I started work, pocket calculators were introduced when I was a young student. And there were some very smart engineers saying, if people don't remember how to use slide rules, they'll never be good engineers. I've never used a slide rule. I thought I was a pretty good engineer when it was happening. And the same thing, on the other hand, we all rely on GPS, and many of us no longer can find our way along on a paper map or remember where we're going. That may be a skill that we want to retain. And so thinking about what skills are okay to leave, what skills do you want to go, and really taking this is a great opportunity for HR leaders or people working with HR leaders to take a really systematic look at talent strategy and how you're going to maintain the skills that you need over time. The issue you raise is a real issue, and we need some solid thinking to make sure you manage it.
Well, here's maybe a little easier question from Madhav. Do you have a recommendation for the best way to adopt GenAI tools? In other words, do you focus on one tool or multiple tools in the initial stages and then mature into one or two over a period of time so that you're not boxed in? Is there experimentation, not just in the use cases, but in the tools themselves? And how do you see that evolving?
Yeah, yes. Right. Eventually you want to get to some kind of standards because that way you get better integration, you get better use of your money, but maybe you want to experiment. The other thing to think about is some tools are better for certain tasks than others. And so you want to do that experimentation, but ideally you want to settle on some standards, at least at the task level, to gain all the values you get from standardization and integration.
Yeah, I like Ethan Mollick's Substack post. If you're not familiar with Ethan Mollick, his Substack is one useful thing. And one of the thought leaders in this space, he has a post a little bit earlier this year called that's about the lab, leadership, the lab, and the crowd, and that these three different elements you need to think about when you are working to implement, because there's a lot of testing and experimentation that goes to answering your question, and it's going to vary depending on the organization. So having this structure of leadership, lab, and crowd is part of how you handle that process.
Great. We have time for one or two more questions. This maybe is too big a question, but Julio says, how do ethical and social responsibilities related to AI, how should those be addressed and implemented at those different levels? Are there different approaches to the ethical and social responsibilities at the different levels?
I think I have to go now.
That is a whole webinar on its own.
Yes, or a day or 2 days.
Yeah. Okay.
I could say one thing though. Well, certainly some things that as we've been doing research on culture in my research teams, what cultures do you need to adopt these AI? One culture change you need is you need to have people gain some humility, that the tools may actually be smarter than them in some places, and that's okay. Right, you can work with them. But the other one, this is really the time to bump up in what you do with your culture awareness and your culture improvement, the ethical side of things, the empathy side of these things. Because it's very easy to do things that may or may not be good for people. And if you can make sure people are considering those, you'll make better decisions.
And you know, you talked about that robots make mistakes, humans make mistakes. So when you think about the sort of quality control and governance and managing that mix, are you seeing models emerge where where people have struck that balance well, and what does that look like?
Certainly things like retrieval augmented generation are helping a lot, because that way it's checking on itself before it goes in. But the other things you want to do is your standard oversight processes, right? Where are wrong decisions being made? Where are we seeing bias in what's happening? And how do we then improve things beyond there? So like I said, the standard things you should be doing with your people anyway, you want to make sure you're doing those with the models too. You can train a model really well to find out it actually has really good performance, but on a very biased data sample, and then you've got problems.
Yeah, I would just add there that we've been talking about bringing AI into our human processes and how do we change what have previously been just human processes. And what George just spoke about was actually we need to change our human processes because we're bringing in AI. So with new tools, with GenAI, we have to think about our evaluation process in a way that we didn't before. Or now that you can produce hundreds of slide decks in very little time, what are we doing with 100 slide decks? Do we need all of the slide decks? What are we here for? And yeah, so part of what I am drawn to with this technology is all of these human aspects that are called into question and that we have to think about and rethink how we work, how we interact. And yeah, it is can be a confusing or scary or daunting place, but it's also an exciting place, and it's a technology unlike any that we've interacted with before.
Yes, very, very interesting times that we live in right now. So lots to explore and learn and to help our organizations move forward. So George and Melissa, thank you so much for this really fabulous presentation, engagement with the audience. Really appreciate your spending time with our audience to do this. And thank you to our sponsor, Celonis, for sponsoring this event. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Bye, everybody.